He just doesn't want us to be successful, that's what he is.
Wow.
Is he watching this on video?
Thousands of people are going to watch this afterwards, so you can...
Oh,
okay. Can they also ask us questions?
Interactive video, yes.
We move around a lot while we ask the questions.
Oh yes, that's people tend to be sort of like popping in front of the camera.
Yeah. Lots of hands going up, you know.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go and ask you questions.
What's your other question?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, yes.
Jeremy!
You're Jeremy, right.
The only one that's not John. I'll change it.
Oh, we're all J's. Yeah,
You're
three
one of the
J's.
coordinators of the Save Doctor Who campaign. Perhaps you'll tell me people here about it.
Has he switched on yet?
Have you switched on?
Yeah.
It's got the red light on.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's switched on.
Oh, is that what the red line is? I knew it meant
Yeah, we
something.
just went away.
Stop prevaricating. We're not going to know.
Stop prevaricating and get on.
I paid good money to come to see you, Jeremy Bentham.
You didn't pay a dime.
You got your money's worth then.
Well, let's take this on. We're not going to be formal today. Yeah. Okay, there, everybody.
Sorry, I'm late.
Just popped up.
Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to do this before a slightly bigger audience later in the day. I think we've got another panel, haven't we?
Yeah, we've got another one later today.
So
We have a chance to actually see people in the audience.
you're
No,
going
no insult, no insult.
to get a chance to hear this first then.
Right.
The big three.
Okay.
Hey, why don't we start with Remember, you guys give us something that we'll spread it around. See by your next panel, and then thoroughly through the whole audience.
Oh, I've written it down for the same.
Paul Darrow's got the flu virus, it's a good one.
That's not a room. Oh, I'm sorry.
Alright, Paul Darrow's got a terrible hangover, which is why he's not putting it here. As you say, at 9:10, something the floodgates open. Okay, now let's tell you what's happening with this campaign, because I must admit, when I first heard about it, I thought that sounds like the most lunatic idea I've ever heard in my life. My God, we got more chance of making elephants fly than getting this thing off the ground. Also, stupid as I was, decided to go along and listen to what these celebrated collection of barristers, lawyers, publicists, and assorted elder statesmen, fans, in other words, all these people are over 30, had to say. And it was quite interesting because we have this new law that's coming to Britain next year. It's called the Citizens' Charter. What is the Citizens' Charter? Well, you've had one of those really bad days you've been trying to get anywhere on a train, and the train's late, and your boss is yelling at him, and you're saying, oh, that's the point of the train, it's late. Well, the idea is that if the service is so bad that really it's costing you your job or promotion prospects and indeed a lot of money sometimes, you can actually sue this public corporation because it's not providing the service which should be agreed between it, the government, and you, the people who use it. So they're going to bring this in. And then somebody had a bright idea. The BBC is a public corporation. Interesting. So what the aim of the exercise is to use the references to the Citizens' Charter to say to the BBC, you're not acting in a wholly responsible manner by not making a series which, the bottom line of which, it costs far less to make than it earns in the vast millions each year that come in from the merchandising, the videos. And if you've heard about the exhibition in London that's currently breaking all records, you can see it's potentially a big earner. Who are the users of the BBC? We are, because everyone in Britain, well, everyone in Britain is required to pay the BBC each year £70.
You really don't know Jerry.
We know who has the BBC.
My headline screened room is we're bound to pay, it's over $100 a year as a tax to the BBC to fund them and to fund their programming. Now, every year they go cap in hand to the government and say, well, we'd like some more money, please, because all inflation being what it is, we need more money to fund programs. Now, you can get to a situation where you can turn around and say, well, actually, we think we're being very irresponsible with money because you've got a show here that potentially can earn you millions upon millions, and you can't use it. So, therefore, we don't think you're being particularly responsible.
It's the IRA.
Let's do these out. It's been turned into a tape recorder.
Miniaturizes there. And so this is actually going to go ahead now. They're actually going to put forward a writ to the BBC to say, basically, we don't think you're handling the product Doctor Who responsibly. You cannot prove to us that you are. And therefore, we would like to bring a review, a judicial review against the BBC to say, to make them accountable for why they're not making Doctor Who when it's got a fabulous track record.
And it earns so much money.
and earn so much money. So that's the aim of the exercise. Now, of course, the big problem is that lawyers don't work for peanuts. They don't work for Marvel Comics in their life, as far as I can figure out. And it does cost a lot of money, so I thought, well, how are we going to raise this money? Because none of us are wealthy. And so the first idea we were going to have was to have a grand raffle. Unfortunately, we came up against a huge, great barrier with that called the National Gaming and Lotteries Association of Great Britain, who said basically, no, you can't. And certainly, if you wanted to open it up beyond the shores of the United Kingdom, which you've got to do, sort of the Australians, the Canadians, the Americans, and
Japanese.
yeah, we actually have a Japanese guy that took to us. And when he speaks Japanese, I'll bring the letter over so I can figure out what the hell it says. And so they said, well, no, you can't do it as a raffle. What we're going to do now, the labour behind, we're going to rethink the whole thing, so it's a scrap of the designs we've got ready for the raffle. And somebody said, well, you can do it as a skill competition, and it has to be a skill competition. We can't just say, well, you know, question 1, what does TARDIS stand for? Question 2, what planet do the Daleks live on? It actually has to be something which requires people to exercise a brain and must be shown to be a game of skill. So then we'll back around and say, well, yeah, came up with the bright idea, well, you were a producer of the series like Doctor Who. Here's 9 criteria for what you might have to observe if you were going to produce the show, like how much importance do you attach to your lead actor, and how much attention would you pay to publicity, what about the budget, and said to people, well, bring to an order of priority. Well, somebody said, well, look, we should judge something like this, you know, maybe we don't know the first thing about producing television. We thought go and find somebody who did, and luckily, you know, we struck gold because 2 of the former producers and script editors of Doctor Who, Barry Letts and Terence Diggs, much to our surprise, said, oh, God, this sounds good, yes, we'll very happily endorse you and help you with that. I thought, oh my God, it's pretty good going. Johnson's told me that a really stinker of an article in from another producer of Doctor Who, Derek Sherwin, who's similarly been fairly critical of the way the BBC operates on its policy towards programming these days. So as far as producers and things going, we're doing quite well. And even the one who's closest to the BBC, John Nathan Turner, has to be a bit careful about what he says and what he supports in case he gets in trouble with people who are basically paying him as a freelance producer of Doctor Who products. Even he said, well, you know, I can't actually support you, I won't obstruct you, or I won't put a veto on anything that goes into Marvel, or anything that goes out on the official network. And so that's now going ahead. So basically what I brought with me today, what I'm going to try and do is talk to as many of the, I suppose you might call fan club organisers here, because we realise one of the biggest problems we've got, particularly asking for Americans for donations, is the fact that to get a pound, international money or cut in pounds, it actually costs about as much as you'd want to donate in getting the bank to cut the cheque for you. So we thought a much better idea is to go to some of the senior fan clubs like Mark Gaspar's, Bentham, things like that, and saying to them, well, you know, can you do this network, this is a local level? So at the end of the day, Mark or something like that is only going to his bank and getting 1 cheque, international money order cut, and then send that over with all the entry forms. So that at the end of the day, it becomes a damn sight more feasible, or a damn sight cheaper as well, for the American audiences and the Canadians and the Australians as well to contribute. So the state of play now is that it's going to be launched very early in December on an official level. What's an official level? There's a lovely program coming up on actually starting now, so we'll find that. The BBC has got no say in this programming because they're required by law to open up a certain amount of their broadcasting hours per year to independent bodies that come in and, if you like, audit the BBC on air. So that, in other words, you, the viewer, have a chance to sit around very much as we're doing now with a ring of people.
Very rude.
And up here, you've got some of the senior, the 6th floor people of the BBC, not just the secretaries or the post group people that you write to or send letters or ring up and complain about, but the actual people who make the programs. And they're actually going to come on down and be on air and actually be, as John says, people become very, very rude with them. Pilot one the other week was all about political bias on the BBC, and boy did it get heated at places. And when we left it, John may know a bit more of this than I do, because he's much more meeting than I did. The idea was that about 20 minutes is going to be turned over to the subject of what the lead is doing or not doing in Doctor Who. And that should be going out sometime in the next couple of weeks.
It's hopefully in December. I talked to the producers of Buyback and they said they were still considering doing a Doctor Who. So I suspect they will be, because I know the BBC are now planning a series of repeats of Doctor Who next year, which is probably to try and offset any criticism from the fan organisation and try and pacify fans who've been writing in for the last 2 years saying, "Will we program that, please?" in the politest terms, and getting nowhere with the company. And basically what it comes down to is what we said on numerous occasions before, both here and in Britain, is that the BBC don't seem to understand exactly why Doctor Who is popular, in the same way that Star Trek perhaps don't realise how much, sorry, Paramount don't realise how much Star Trek is propping up their organisation in terms of keeping it financially viable. Doctor Who could be turned into the same sort of phenomenon that Star Trek is in this country, and still maintain the same sort of standards of story writing and acting quality, which I hope will be what Paramount does today.
Because one of the things we have to do for this review is literally get together evidence that supports the popularity of Who. And it's just fascinating. John and people like myself have been racing around trying to get these researchers. People like Andrew Pixley, who's one of the senior researchers for the monthly, and have some fantastic statistics about showing how the programme has been highly popular when basically you're doing very good shows. Very few people here, I think, would doubt that something like The Talons of Wen Chiang is one of the peaks of Doctor Who in terms of its production. Sure enough, Wen Chiang is up there, easily challenging a lot of the any of the output on any of the channels at any other time of those years. So all you're saying is there's nothing wrong with the Doctor Who formula. It's still as good as it was back in 1963. It's only how you interpret it and the people you put in place to make the series that determines whether you're generating something that, well, in our country, 14 billion is considered absolutely top-rating audience material, or you're turning out something that's perhaps less successful and may only be getting you 3 or 4 million, which is still actually considered successful by certain criteria that have been applied these days. There was a recent meeting which was judging how BBC programming was faring against the fact that BBC One is not doing terribly well at the moment. They should be getting roughly 50% of the audience against ITV, the independent companies. Fortunately not. If you look down our top 20 according to the Nielsen ratings, there's about 4 BBC programmes in there at the moment.
And all soaps.
And all soaps. So they're big, expensive, overpriced, over-budgeted, enormously expensive and private dramas have been doing this year, which in a normal commercial organisation would be an awful lot of people kicking an awful lot of butts about this. But as the BBC, they know best. They're not worried about it yet.
And they can always go to the government and ask for some more money anyway.
Absolutely. Or ask for our money.
Yeah, that's right.
Question down the front.
Yes, I was curious what the nature of the BBC charter is with regard to its obligation. It doesn't seem to be a complicated organization, so what's the existence?
That is true, but there's a little string to that though. That charter comes up for renewal in 1996. It's been going for 50 years now, more or less, since the end of the war. Now, it does say that they have got a right, or we have the right to expect them to produce programming, and it is their business, basically, as their charter says, to educate, inform, and entertain. So they do have a responsibility to uphold that standard. Now, the trouble is, what do you define as being entertainment, information, and is there something in there that specifically says you've got to produce a program called Doctor Who? No, there isn't. However, we can't really sue them on the grounds that they're abusing their charter, which is true. But what you can do is, again, this is things you only learn from listening to these lawyers, is you can say that they're not using the product they've got responsibly and in the best way to make a success of it. What we mean by this? The example I was given was, suppose you had suddenly invented a serum that cured cancer. However, because we only earn about a couple of dollars a week sort of thing, we're not really getting in a position to exploit it. However, you don't want to get rid of this. Hey, this is a potential world beater here, I'd like to sell it. Well, there is a law of precedent that's been established that says if someone is acting irresponsibly with something which is demonstrably for greater public good, then there is a law that says it should be able to be given over to a body which can make the best use of it, providing that those who devise it receive adequate compensation, etc. for the product. See, this brings us to the other problem with Doctor Who, and this was outlined to me by a producer, unfortunately who's no longer with us, called Graham Williams, who preceded John Nathan on the programme. And he tried to launch a programme called the Zodiac Factor way back in the mid-70s, which was going to be a mega series of 12 parts. Each one of the 12 film mini-movies would have it would be based around one of the signs of the zodiac. And they got tremendous cooperation from some of the senior script writers of Great Britain contributing scripts. And indeed, those scripts have nearly all gone on to be successful novels or have been adapted into screenplays in their own right. And Raymond was one of those people actually on the project team to get that off the ground. So they took it before the big groups of the BBC and said, look, we've got all these clearances, we've got all this agreement, the money's come in somewhere in the region of about £5 million being pledged into this by the independent programme makers who want to make it with us. We usually said, no, no, we don't think you've adequately considered the fixed floating costs on this one. Sorry, fixed what? What is fixed floating costs? And what it came down to is the BBC were very worried about this because it's the first time they've tried to go into making feature films for television. It hadn't really happened before then. And their concern was as well, who's going to own the rights to this possibly mega successful project? Because the independent companies pledged, say, $5 billion into financing this. The BBC has effectively got to come up with $5 billion and 15 cents to own just enough equities that say, it's our programme, we decide what we're going to do then. The trouble is that the BBC drama department doesn't actually have $5 million and 50 cents free, then they can't really put up their pennies onto the table to actually get the programme off the ground and control it. And that is exactly what happened with the Zodiac Factor. They weren't prepared to stake that amount of money into a feature film series. The only way they could get around it was by saying that their own staff started screwed up. Oh dear, we miscalculated the whole thing, the planning's gone hell, the business plan is shot. Well, no one will sack a few people, and it was terribly sorry to come back a few years' time with this project. A couple of very senior people at the BBC resigned over what happened. And it's partly as a result of this that thinking, well, what can we do with Graham Williams, who did all the work on the Zodiac Factor, that he actually got the job of replacing Philip Hinchcliffe as producer on Doctor Who. So that's a very good example of how BBC internal politics works, which is very often very deviously.
Sounds very similar to the way what's happening with people who are trying to bidding to produce Doctor Who now, i.e. they're putting up a lot of money, having got support from American networks to transmit the show after they've transmitted it in Britain all at the same time. And the BBC has got to put up the same amount of money, and they're not prepared to. Well, they're not able in a position at the moment to, but I've recently learned that they're actually would mean they can actually be shown on the networks here or anywhere worldwide. They're up to the standards to be able to, for high definition and things like that.
I mean, one of the programmes you made, some of you may not have seen, Bill here has heard of Red Dwarf, comedy series Red Dwarf. Now, Red Dwarf is a perfect example of what Doctor Who really should become, because that is produced independently. It was by Noel
We
Gate.
hasten to add not in terms of the comedy mode.
It is Noel Gate. It was produced originally by Noel Gate, who now has become his Grant Naylor.
Yes, Grant Naylor.
The actual writers have now formed a company to make it. What they do is essentially they go into a partnership with the BBC, a very symbiotic partnership, to actually make the Red Dwarf series, so that finance comes in both from Noel Gate Television, or Paul Jackson as it is, and from the BBC, who provide basically facilities for Red Dwarf. And because under some peculiar anomaly that goes right back to the 50s, comedy has always been higher budgeted than drama. Red Dwarf has currently got the highest production values in terms of technical expertise of any programme being made anywhere in Britain. To give you an example, next season, which starts airing, I think, in February, January on BBC Two, they are using 35mm film, which is the sort of stuff that big budget films get used for their miniature work. They are also going to be doing underwater miniature photography, which, whereas you saw have you seen The Curse of Fenric, they did underwater shooting for that, but they've never done underwater miniature shooting. We're not talking here Jerry Anderson stuff where you basically film it behind the fish tank. We're actually talking about divers doing the kind of work that possibly you may have seen on something like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, where they actually took miniatures out into water and underwater. And that is phenomenally expensive. You know, you're talking the special effects budget for Red Dwarf would pay for a whole season of Doctor Who. 14 episodes Doctor Who just by itself, which was a statistic that has to be floored me, but it is absolutely true. But you have a proven product there, which is still riding high on the crest of its wave, and the comedy department of BBC believes very highly of Red Dwarf, and of course the independent programme makers believe very highly of Red Dwarf, and its sales and the resulting feedback from Red Dwarf is saying they're not putting a foot wrong so far.
It's also enabled them to test out the legal practices in terms of actually licensing Red Dwarf on T-shirts, on videos, and in books, because the creators still maintain the rights to most of the scripts, and if they adapt the book, then they get the cut of it. On the Doctor Who movie, one of the big hold-ups at the early stages that I'm aware of was that the BBC wanted 30 to 40% of all the royalty on any licensed product that spun out from the movie, and I suspect that's one of the other problems that's holding up any licensing deal on Doctor Who if it comes back as an independent production. So in a way, you can probably see Red Dwarf as being either a bit of a test pilot for the way these independent productions may go in the future with BBC. It's working now, so therefore it's a good idea, and they may do more of them. Just have to wait and see.
See, that's the big problem, is it all comes down to lots of the questions of royalties, how the money is split up. The BBC is demanding 40%, and we are talking there as BBC and the corporation. You've also got to worry about the fact that, well, who else is eligible for the rights? Red Dwarf is fairly simple to do because it's basically two writers, Grant and Naylor. Doctor Who, as John Beale will tell you, the breakdown of royalties and the problems that trying to reach agreement on royalties, of course, is why, well, it's one of the reasons why you haven't seen Evil of the Daleks and Power of the Daleks yet, much to my intense chagrin.
I'm not sure it's over yet, no. The problem is, of course, that everybody wants a slice of the pie, and the more people there are involved, the smaller the slices get. And what the real problem here with merchandising is, the BBC basically wants 40% of everything for nothing. And that's where most of the merchandising problems hold up, because if they're not putting anything into it, if they're not actually making the show, if they're not doing anything, why should they get anything? So if they were more reasonable and said, well, 10%, they would probably get it. Because it's easier to say, okay, let's do it on that basis and, you know, not argue. Whereas asking 40%, well, if you're talking like, let's take, for example, something like the Daypole figures. You market a figure at a certain price. Now, the price that you pay for these Daypole figures is not the amount of money that obviously gets back to the manufacturer, because the toy stores mark up generally around 50% of the price, sometimes even more than that. So maybe half the money will be going back to the manufacturer. The manufacturer has to pay for the actual process of manufacturing, packaging, advertising. He has to pay his workers for doing the job, and then of course he has to pay them whoever created the toy in the first place. So in the case of something like a Dalek, Terry Nation gets his cut, the BBC gets their cut. So by the time you get down to the end of it, there's not a lot of money going around a lot of hands. Now the BBC's coming in and saying automatically, we want 40% of that money, even though all we're doing is giving you permission to do this. And that's been a very big sticky point for a lot of the negotiations, because as you probably realize, if you go to your toy stores, merchandising TV shows is big business. You can make a fortune from it. I mean, literally, I'm not joking here. I talked to an artist called Kevin Johnson, and Kevin has done a lot of very good covers for paperbacks and hardcovers over here. And he and a couple of friends deliberately created a series called The Visionaries, which you may have seen in the toy stores. They didn't last long. But they were told basically that they could easily pull in $1 million a year just because they had created these characters. They hadn't done any of the work on actually making the models or anything. They had created the characters which would be used. So, I mean, they would have pulled in $1 million a year just for coming up with the initial concept. The toy stores, you know, the toy firms themselves make a lot of their money from this kind of thing. I mean, G.I. Joe, after all these years, is going like crazy. And I think The Little Mermaid is literally keeping Disney afloat. I mean, you've seen how much merchandising there is on The Little Mermaid. And this is a movie which was out 2 years ago, and there's been virtually nothing else on it. And yet, there's so much merchandising on it. And a lot of those revenues go back to Disney, who you can be sure are not paying anybody else.
Yeah.
So it's big business.
If you go to try and get something licensed from Paramount on Star Trek, you're paying Paramount and that's it. If you go to the BBC, to get something licensed from Doctor Who, like Dalek, you're not just paying BBC, you pay them their cut, and then you pay Terry Nation his cut, or not Terry Nation, but his agent, and Terry Nation gets the money eventually, I'm sure.
And if they use a photograph on the box?
So they use a photograph in the box, they've got to pay for it, so it's quite frightening. It can be very expensive, which is really bizarre because the people are cutting their own throats. But it's also the fault of people who want to license the product who aren't prepared to bend with the wind. And what I found over 3 years of editing Doctor Who magazine is that, yes, as long as you aren't crossing anybody, certainly actors, and you make sure that they're paid, or if somebody you haven't been able to contact before, you do contact, and then go back and tell them how much money they're owed from BBC photographs, which are used in the magazine, then you're more likely to get their help when it comes to an interview, or they're going to be supportive of a convention like this one, for example, and say, well, Doctor Who magazine is really very good, which from our point of view, is an editorial validation that cannot be matched. Sylvester McCoy, in that respect, has been very helpful for us, and as other people like Anthony Ainley, his position he wasn't too happy with the magazine because they said, do you think I got things sorted out? I think it's really important. If you cross people, then you get them around, but at the same time, you don't want to be burnt by them either, if you see what I mean. Make sure you get a good deal and they get a good deal.
Did you annoy the BBC when you changed the logo on the magazine?
No, we went to the BBC with the distinct intention of changing it to something that was in line with the video releases in Britain. And the BBC on their video releases have always used that diamond logo. Because there's no programme, we immediately went back to something that was recognisable in the hope that the major newsagent chain, W.H. Smith's, which funny enough owns the gift shop in this hotel.
Yes,
which I found really bizarre. Because they use that logo, and it's used in America as well, I think, we said this is the one that people are going to recognise, and it's much better magazine logo. I mean, I really quite like that Starfield effect. I know it was very glitzy and glossy, but it's very effective on television. It just can grab people who are used to the special effects Starfield sequences they may see in Star Trek The Next Generation, etc. But I still think that diamond logo is much better.
So it's the one that stands out from the show.
Yeah, they want me use it for my books, though.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Why not?
Because
that's the
BBC
term.
books are licensed by a different part of BBC Enterprises.
Mhm.
So when WHR go to BBC to get a book done, they've got to use the current logo. And as far as the BBC books are concerned, they sort of like think the current logo is the one that's last used on television.
74 million years ago.
It may not have occurred to Peter Dardenne, so you can change it. So he may have his own marketing policy. He may feel that that's the one that people are more likely to recognise. In which case,
Well, for a book cover also, when you're looking at a magazine cover, the diamond logo doesn't take up too much space. On a book cover, it takes a lot more space. You've got the New Adventures there. I mean, you can imagine what that would look like if we had the diamond logo on it too, rather than the little compact logo we have. So there is that consideration to take into effect. But there's also just the fact that the BBC doesn't know what it's doing.
The left arm never knows what the right arm.
Well, actually,
Sticks came out with the best quote. It says, "Never blame anything on conspiracy. What can be put down to incompetence." I think that sums up the situation.
when there was a chance of me doing Evil of the Daleks, I tried to get hold of the scripts from the BBC. And I called them up and I said, "Excuse me, I have the rights to do this novel. Can I have the scripts?" And I went for about half an hour through these people at the BBC, and they kept passing me back and said, "Well, do you want script department?" And then you get the script department. No, you want merchandising. You get merchandising. No, I think that's production you want. And they get you over there. Finally, after about half an hour of this, the person on the other end of the phone says, Doctor Who, that's a radio program, right?" I said, "No, it's a TV program. You produce this TV program called Doctor Who." This is when it was still on the air, mind you. Not now, but this is when it was on the air. "You produce this TV program called Doctor Who." Oh. Well, why are you talking to radio then? I'm like, I've been talking to radio. I talked to about 14 different people, and not one of them knew that Doctor Who was a TV show. And this was actually at the BBC itself. So you have some idea of how they're organised there, right?
And this is John spending his money on phone calls, so the bill was going around like a cash
Yeah.
at this point.
So I just get a little disgusted. It's astonishing. The incompetence in the BBC is extremely high level, isn't it? Anyway, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Oh,
Man with a video machine.
Just can you smile more?
I was wondering, the future of the show, like off the air for now, what would you say would be the future of the magazines and books and novels?
Well, in terms of all the Doctor Who spin-off merchandise, it's very akin to Star Trek, in that Star Trek continued in different forms long after the initial series finished. And then when it came back, they were still there. The pocketbooks were still around, were being printed and written during the period the program was off the air. I think, am I right about that? Yeah. And in the same way, the New Adventures will continue Doctor Who and continue to keep Doctor Who in their public eye. I mean, they've sold over 30,000 copies of the first book, which may sound small in this country, but in Britain, that's a very, very good sale for it.
Well, to give you some idea, my first Doctor Who novel was The Chase, which was a very popular book. It was the best-selling Doctor Who title that year, and it sold around 22,000 copies in 1 year. Time Warp Genesis, on the other hand, sold 25,000 copies in 3 weeks. So you can see that there is certainly no problem with merchandising. I mean, the very fact that there was a new adventure brought the fans out. They bought that book and it was gone from the stores in 3 weeks. They had to reprint 3 times.
That's why we've taken the policy with the magazine to introduce more fiction, like reprinting the original TV21 Daleks, stripping cut in full colour, rather than patchy black and white rubbish that happened in the early issue of the magazine. Continuing the comic strip and introducing a few more fiction and expanding the page count. We're responding to a very extensive audience survey that we did 2 years ago, which indicated that people weren't worried particularly about the price. If they were interested in Doctor Who, as long as they were getting a good quality product, they would be prepared to pay for it. And £2.25 was the price that they said they were prepared to pay for 52 pages. And the majority of our audience is still in Britain, and we take our lead from that audience. And Marvel US have pegged the price of the magazine at $4.50, which still makes it a very expensive item. I know it's more expensive than Starlog, but Starlog has over 300,000 sales, and we don't have that anywhere near that level of circulation in this country.
See, it does really come down to what John said earlier about the BBC does not understand the strength of the products that they have. It seems to be a curious fact of life that if you take something away from the public or the people don't like having that taken away from them. If it still sits in their mind as something they rather like. And although Doctor Who has had its strengths and its weaknesses in terms of the actual people who've sat down and said they watched the current episode, the ethos of the series that spans this 27-year period is still strong enough to say, I love this Doctor Who beyond. Yes, I remember being rather good, and they remember the good ones. Now, the more dedicated you are, I mean, we're talking here about the demographic difference between a general public member who sat down and watched a few good ones, and the one that every week has got these couple of videos sitting there and he's taking it and sort of live. Now, as we go nearer towards that end of the scale, obviously, you tend to get this, as John was saying about Star Trek, and they close ranks, they get more intense about it. The more intense it goes, the more in a peculiar way, support for the outer hub, what's going on without the program itself being made, gets stronger. In London, in July, an experimental exhibition was launched at our Museum of the Moving Image, which is, if you like, a museum to do with film, television, to degree theatre as well, mostly film and television. Basically, about Doctor Who. It's quite expensively mounted. They spent about £65,000, about £100,000. 45. So it's about $90,000 launching this exhibition. And ever since that's been opened, the associated merchandise shop, which is pegged on to the Museum of Moving Image, their takings have gone up in the time of recession 50%. So they're doing 50% better business than they did.
What's happened is they've been given a product which the public are familiar with, which they've marketed very, very successfully. They've used a very successful and funny advertising campaign to attract people into the booths. For example, some of the tube, which what would be the L of Chicago, the subway trains have these adverts on with Davros and 2 Daleks in the pictures. If these people try and jump the queue at Moni, let them,
The other one that says, "Isn't it time you saw your doctor?"
Yeah, 7 pictures of all 7. And the number of people through the door has increased by 50,000 as they've had 50,000 more people through the door than they had the previous year as a result of this exhibition.
The biggest advertisement is actually on the bank of the River Thames itself, just by Waterloo Station, which is on the bank of the Thames. It is nothing more than a 200-foot long sink plunger. And underneath it says, "Come and see the sink plunger that conquered the universe." And that drove them in droves.
And it's now being extended until April or May next year. So I'm working with the people who are putting it together.
And this is all a show that the BBC says is not really successful.
Yeah, so you can sit there and say,
Well, no, let's go on to some of the shows the BBC considers successful.
Clangers.
Sorry?
No,
The Clangers? No. They're doing quite well, actually. No. I mean, if you look at the prestige productions of the BBC, very few of them survive a single repeat, let alone any kind of extensions. And yet the BBC spends a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, and gets virtually no comeback from it. And yet look at this, everything around Doctor Who, and they will not acknowledge any of it. In fact, wasn't one time, for example, the BBC was actually taking money away from Doctor Who, I believe, to fund the Forsyte Saga. They were taking a lot of energy, a lot of efforts and everything to fund the Forsyte Saga, which was incredibly popular when it was shown. But how many of you have seen it within the last 15 years?
That's probably more down to the fact that it's been repeated.
Why hasn't it been repeated?
"Oh, yes."
Because nobody wants to watch it again, right?
I don't think that's true at all.
Well, it's probably not true. It was actually repeated over here in about 1980.
It is true that
they
they spent this year 2 very big productions of theirs. One is called The House of Elliot, so it's a 20s costume drama. And the other one is a contemporary drama set in the world of horse racing called Trainer. Now both of those have been enormously expensive, but there's no way they're going to ultimately recoup their costs, because in this country they're getting about the same ratings that Doctor Who got in its final season over there.
One of the funniest things about the ratings for Doctor Who in its last season is the reason they cite that the programme should be taken off the air. It got about 4 million viewers, and it was placed against Britain's leading soap, as I'm sure most of you are aware. It got about 4 million viewers. At a recent internal meeting of the BBC of department heads, the programme that is currently placed against Coronation Street, Tomorrow's World, which is a documentary programme about science, development and science and technology, it's getting 4 million viewers. And they say, well, this is rather good, isn't it, really? I'm patting each other on the back, but it's getting 4 million viewers against Coronation Street. So it's one rule for one thing.
Again, this comes down to the bit about politics, because when they scheduled Doctor Who against Coronation Street, they were at that time BBC had just launched its own quite popular soap called EastEnders, basically about life in the East End of London, which they were really promoting and pushing hell. Now the thing they had with Doctor Who was what you might call the torpedo in the side of the Lusitania, because they had this big line at Coronation Street, and you had this emergent soap, EastEnders, that was climbing up, but what they needed to do was really to go in there and say, our investment in EastEnders has really pulled off. And if you put Doctor Who slamming into the side of Coronation Street, it is going to take some ratings away from Coronation Street. There will be strong enough support for Doctor Who to be able to take just Coronation Street just that far. EastEnders would be able to go above it. And indeed, for those period of years, the BBC's soap EastEnders was the #1 programme, therefore vindicating all those people with powers and the planning behind it into EastEnders. But now Doctor Who's not there, big surprise, Coronation Street is back up on the top again. So really, I thought it was what a terrible waste of all the talent, the effort, the time, the technicians, the studios, producing nothing more than a very elaborate 14-week torpedo.
Yeah, and they used Doctor Who to test out EastEnders in the first place. They actually put on Doctor Who twice a week in Britain, in the slots that eventually were filled by the EastEnders soap program, to find out if there was a regular audience and enough of a regular audience for another soap. And what they have discovered basically is that people do like the soaps and they'll watch every single one. They'll watch Coronation Street, they'll watch EastEnders, they'll watch Brookside, they'll watch
All the hundreds of
Neighbours,
soaps.
and all the others, yes.
So why don't they make Doctor Who a soap?
There are some people who argue it works that way. Certainly when you were looking in the 60s and the 70s as a weekly turnaround, I mean, what is a soap? A soap is basically a continuing drama. Certainly in the 60s when Doctor Who was on, about 48 weeks of a 52-week year, you could almost argue that it was a soap. It was certainly having that, it obeys all the rules of soap opera. You've got continuing characters, developing situations, ongoing sets, and such like. So, whereas Doctor Who ceased to become a soap. I don't see anything wrong in adopting, certainly the soap style of writing for Doctor Who. In fact, really,
especially because the standards on British soaps are probably very much higher than they are here. Things like EastEnders are now used to present contemporary situations, such as dealing with AIDS, such as dealing with homosexuality and fear in everyday relationships, that sort of thing. Things that sort of like may rankle elsewhere or be shuffled off into the graveyard hours, rather than confront people with these things that actually happen and can't do anything about it. And they're being used very successfully.
Indeed, it does demand a very high degree of discipline from writers to be able to write soaps, because you really have to work at a much more emotive level. Whereas I think, probably quite fairly, Doctor Who has been criticised, I suppose, even by the fans, for the fact that it only really has worked on a superficial level in basic years, telling entertaining stories, but not really getting underneath how characters react to situations. My own personal feeling is that's when Doctor Who's always worked best, when you concentrated on how people react to the fact that there's Cybermen outside, rather than actually trying to set up this incredibly devious, very science fiction oriented plot at the end of the day. So what's the time? Is something again? There is another problem which has still got to be got over with the BBC, in that the BBC is divided into two empires, well, television empires, BBC One and BBC Two. They are very highly autonomous. Now, there are two heads. Each channel has its own head. BBC Two's head is a guy called Alan Yentl, and the head of BBC One is Jonathan Powell. To give you an idea of the difference between the two men, Alan Yentl has suddenly woken up to the fact that cult television and science fiction is a really good idea. The top-rated programme on BBC Two now is a rerun of the 1960s puppet series called Thunderbirds, which some of you may possibly have heard of. They pulled that out of the archives, and the first time it's been shown in about 10 years. Put it on a prime spot, and it has cleaned up their ratings. There's a whole new generation coming and sitting down and watching it. And it's, they can't do enough. The publicity that high, the merchandisers are happy that we might go 1965 all over again, chaps. It's looking good.
And the irony is, though, of course, it was made for independent television.
Yes.
Not for the BBC in the first place.
But yet, obviously, thought that's a bloody good idea. So we now have on BBC Two Star Trek: The Next Generation, Quantum Leap, Red Dwarfs coming up soon, Kolchak the Night Stalker, which has never previously been shown in Britain. Wonderful night of all these sort of B-movie things, and the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and things like that, which is really great late-night television.
And also early, same slot, 6 o'clock in the evening, films, feature films, science fiction feature films on a Thursday. They basically decided that 6 o'clock was a good spot to put in science fiction assemblies.
And so literally there is a huge saturation of science fiction and what I might call cult programming at BBC Two.
It's all the people who don't want to watch the news, I think. They're just so depressed with it.
Now, BBC One, there's nothing, single inch of science fiction. And it's all because of the fact that Alan Yentl is highly supportive and pleased about it. But Jonathan Powell, who was unofficially quoted not so long ago saying that Doctor Who comes back over my dead body, ain't really got a gun.
So, why don't they put the reruns, like the way old reruns that they have?
Well, they are planning to do some reruns of Doctor Who next year. It's still in the early stages, but the problem with reruns on the BBC is that just as licensing has its problems, so does repeats on the BBC, and they have an agreed amount of repeat programming a year, which is about 36 hours or something like that.
It's been extended.
Maybe extended. It's very, very small. It's not as bad as it was. I don't think it's that low anymore. There's recently been a deal with Equity, and Nicholas Courtney can probably tell you more about that because he's actually the head of it, one of the heads of Equity now. But they've agreed a deal so they can actually show some more programming. They've recently celebrated the fact that we're closing one of their old studios down by having a whole day's programme. Only the BBC could do this.
Celebrate the fact
Celebrate that they're shutting up one of their production facilities by showing a whole lot of programmes that were made there. And Doctor Who actually got a rating of about 1.7 million, which wasn't much, but it was being shown at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on probably one of the hottest August bank holidays we've ever had. Public holidays. And that's what prompted Alan Yentl to think about showing more Doctor Who, because it was very, based on that success. And I think he'll get the ratings. He'll continue, and he did very well. BBC Two did very well with something called The Five Faces of Doctor Who back in 1982. And we'll just have to see how it goes. As far as I'm aware, the plans are to show some early in the year, break over the summer, and then start again in the winter. So we'll get quite a good run of Doctor Who, which makes me happy because I think our newspaper distributors to wise up to this. Doctor Who's been back on television again, even if it is repeats.
I have another question of a totally non-Doctor Who thing.
That's okay.
But it deals with Marvel. I see that Doctor Who magazine for Star Trek The Next Generation.
Yes.
How is it, and is it ever going to likely appear on the shows?
It's just been cancelled. As far as I'm aware, when I flew out on Tuesday, it had run for 26 issues. It was probably, I have to say, and this is the agreement, most of the people within Marvel, the first few issues were diabolical rubbish. They were the worst thing we'd ever produced, and they weren't produced within my department. We took it over, we quickly made it a magazine with the same sort of format as Doctor Who magazine. Unfortunately, the license was such that we had to depend on reprint material from the Starlog Next Generation magazine and from DC Comics Star Trek comic strip. We weren't allowed to originate, and the problems with originating and getting Paramount to actually turn things around in time to produce stuff were frightening. They were being very, very slow. And the sales just didn't seem to be there. I don't know why. Because TV Zone, which is a British produced magazine, does very well. It brings Star Trek on its covers and sells very well. It's not a licensed product. And Starburst, which is a BBC, which is a British magazine, also does very well at promoting Star Trek. So we know there's a market for Star Trek. We know the ratings are there for Star Trek. But our distributors who also, funnily enough, distribute Starburst and TV Zone, didn't seem to want to distribute Star Trek The Next Generation magazine.
Well, part of it is probably because it was reprint material. Most of the fans will have the original.
Well, yes, that's true, but I think what I felt was that they didn't. I agree with you on that to a certain extent. I think the design quality of the later magazines was good, but because the first few weeklies were not very good at all, that was the major problem. Whereas at least on Doctor Who Weekly, the comic strip sustained the fact that most of the other, the shorter archives that Jeremy slaved hours into the night to produce, with 3 BBC stills carefully put away, sent to them. I think the Doctor Who Weekly survived because it was a lot more energy in it than the early Star Trek magazine did. And it was only licensed for Britain, which is why you haven't seen it in this country. It's a shame because Doctor Who depends on sales in America as well as in Britain, just as the books do, most of it. The BBC, for example, W.H. Allen and I planning to do a Blake 7 book, which Andrew Pixley, our major researcher, is actually working on. It's still in the contract stages, but they depended on getting an American distributor to be able to actually produce this book, because it's going to be hardback. It's not cheap thing to do, especially in a recession, a worldwide recession, except Italy, funny enough, which is very weird. And so this is what, so they had to work very hard to get this thing off the ground. Now they've got an American distributor, the book can go ahead.
See, a very, very hard part for any publisher to get over is who's actually going to buy the product that they're planning, and how do we plan that product to get the audience that we'd like to buy it, like we catch-22. As John was saying, we had an awful lot of problems with the early weekly, which then became Doctor Who Monthly, in that when you first launched it, question of, well, how do we do it? Do we do it as comic strips, do we do it as magazines, format, do we do it as features, do we do it as light-hearted, do we do it heavyweight? Well, they tried a weekly and thought, well, let's go for what we think is perhaps the teenage audience, the type of people who are watching Doctor Who. Well, it went along so-so, but it wasn't doing anything too wonderful as a weekly.
This is the sales curve.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I actually found the figures in an old file the other day. It was just like this until we put it in.
So then they made the decision, okay, well, perhaps we're aiming this too high. Let's see if we can get younger people who perhaps like Tom Baker. And so there's a deliberate policy, which I think lasted about 9, 10, possibly a bit longer issues, this is the weekly days, to take it down market and appeal much more to a younger audience. And that was even more disastrous. It literally went, as John said, that sales drop you could hit, you would see it plummeting to the ground, spectacular, like a used firework. So again, another rethink, okay, what can we do now? And then they started saying, well, perhaps let's go the other way. Let's see if we aim for the 20-somethings, 30-somethings market by putting more serious material. And they did that. And that, I think, stopped the rot a little bit, but not half as much as the decision to make it into a monthly publication, which then meant you could have more pages that looked thicker, more substantial, more photographs, hopefully a higher standard of writing. And that finally halted the rot, and after about sort of 30 issues, finally it found the plateau that it was comfortable on. I think with a lot of publications you'll find that is a problem that has to be tackled. In Britain, I'm talking about Thunderbirds a little bit earlier, they've just brought out a publication to support the fact that the series is doing great guns. Thunderbirds, well, it's bi-weekly and every 2 weeks. Now, it's very good, it's quite expensive, but unfortunately, it's, you know, I bought it for, God, you know, it's being written for the brain dead here.
It's been written for the audience they think are watching Thunderbirds, but what they haven't realised is that the people who are actually tuning in to watch Thunderbirds are the same people who watched it back in 1965, and they're sitting their kids down in front of it saying, "This is really good," and the kids going, "It sucks." I can see the strings. You know, they're used to a much more sophisticated style of programming. But, the people who are, what they're going from issue 6, you know, even faster than Doctor Who Weekly or Star Trek, and they're going to a very much more feature-oriented magazine that introduced with people who worked on behind the scenes and such like, which I think is very important.
So they come to John in the first place.
I would have told them that. I mean, at least we know that Red Dwarf is going to be that sort of format because they're doing a Red Dwarf comic from January, and that will be the same format as maybe Doctor Who magazine has done, but as far as I can tell.
Just upset all people here is like, what are we going to do?
Well, I don't know. I suspect it's a Freeway Editions magazine, and almost certainly it will be distributed in this country in some format or other. But I'm sure you'll be able to get it somehow through one of the dealers down in the
Well, that's a blatant plug.
Go and see Bruce Campbell because he will not be able to get you a copy. Let's have some more questions. Yes.
I'm just curious in general what the future is for the magazine, the plans in the future, and who's going to feel any books about.
Well, from the magazine's point of view, as you've seen, we've just revamped it. That was the response, my response to the fact that that Marvel decided they wanted to put the price up, and I said, well, you can't put it up without increasing the page count. We knew it worked because we'd done it last year, so we increased it to 52 pages as per the results of our survey and put it to 225, which has sustained it because the sales are still, for a magazine that depends on it's supposed to depend on a program being on air. It's done very well over the last 2 years. And the format will stay the same for the next couple of years, I suspect. I think it's a very good format. It works very well. It gives people the features they're wanting, the more extensive archive that people wanted, and also the fictional stuff which carries Doctor Who on in new formats. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but the first Doctor Who comic strip was first produced in November 1964, and now means the comic strip is now in longer, virtually continuous production than the program itself. So I'm quite pleased with that, and we plan to continue that way. We're also launching a few more specials. We'll probably be doing some more specials next year in connection with Doctor Who. It does depend on sales. In the specialty shops in America and in Britain, our summer special, which you may or may not have seen, actually sold out. But in the news trade, it wasn't as good, which prompted me to suggest that they should supply more copies to the specialty shops than they did. And I hope that the unit special, which is all originated material, it's all new material, will sell very well as well. Again, there are some copies downstairs where there were yesterday.
What about the yearbook?
And the yearbook we're planning to do again. That was a hardback, which is essentially what we call an annual. There are British annuals, this long tradition of doing annuals.
Very well quality.
Very well quality. And with the Doctor Who yearbook, I took the policy, well, I don't want to particularly do with the yearbook the Doctor Who annual was. It was done by World Distributors, so what I want to do is create something completely new, using the fiction material which will appeal to a wide range of kids, and provide the archive material that people wanted, hence the long listing that you can update as more episodes are found or as more videos become available. And I think that's basically it for the magazine. We'll continue as we're going with a 13 issues a year schedule. It's still selling well. Obviously, as a commercial publication, if it doesn't sell well, then it will be cancelled. But that seems a long way off. And with the repeats in Britain, that will probably help. What the problem here is that all the PBS stations are losing Doctor Who because the science fiction channel, which as we all know will start next week, and pigs will fly.
Pig with wings fly around.
When that's because they are losing the rights to the science fiction channel, we're told that the Doctor Who's been taken off our PBS stations. I have been told and you would need to talk to Mark Gasper, who runs the Vision Network, who runs downstairs. He has information that apparently Guy and Art are now considering selling the rights back to PBS stations because it's been such a long time for science fiction channels to come around, and they're obviously losing money out of the merchandising.
Yes, what John's trying to say is we got it wrong. It wasn't because the episodes were overpriced, which is what I believe has appeared in most of the fan and monthly press.
Yeah.
It is because you can only really give the rights to one particular group of people at any one time. You can't have just about everybody showing Doctor Who right left and centre. If the science fiction channel was to have achieved anything, presumably it would have demanded some degree of exclusivity in its broadcasting. However, as John says, the science fiction channel isn't being huge overnight launch pad as.
Well, if you figure it, I mean, you've had two cable channels in this country, with Ha and the Comedy Channel, and they had to amalgamate, and they still weren't successful. So how successful was a science fiction fantasy channel going to be? I suspect it probably has more chance than the Comedy Channel because there is a much stronger fan following, and they're more likely to ask for the things that they want. Moving on to other things, one of the things that Marvel will be doing is to promote Doctor Who as a comic strip character, which the BBC are very happy to do. The BBC Enterprises being the commercial arm of the BBC are a little bit better than they were maybe 2 years ago when I first came to member conventions. And they've prepared to allow us to use Doctor Who in Marvel comics that we produce. Marvel are producing 5 new comic books next year. This is Marvel London for the American market. One of which is a character called Motormouth, who will be first appearing in this country in a comic called The New Warriors, which you may have seen. She'll be featured in that. And I'm hoping to coordinate with the editor in Britain to feature Doctor Who in that, so there will be a crossover which will raise the awareness of Doctor Who as a comic strip character and hopefully boost the sales of the magazine as a fictional. So we'll have to see how that goes. That's part of my deal for moving on from Doctor Who magazine to do the comic strip.
Yes, because John's leading us.
This is my last convention. There's the Doctor Who editor. Anyway, what these people are doing.
Well, Jared Motley, what am I doing in connection with Doctor Who novels or books? Nothing. That's the easy answer. The reason for that simply being that the Virgin took on a big gamble by launching a line of books which is just under the Doctor Who logo. I mean, they are just Doctor Who books. They have committed themselves to doing the 4 Time Worm books, which are now out, and to do 3 Cat's Cradle novels. The Gallifrey Chronicles was their first hardcover, and they're doing a few other sort of factual books in the background. They've done the Terrestrial Index. Any further novelizations will still come out with the Target banner. Only new material will be coming out of the Doctor Who logo. But, of course, all of this was planned quite a long time ago, going back to the beginning of last year, we're talking now, and they put a hold on everything until they saw how the books started to sell. Because it was a big gamble. Would people buy new Doctor Who novels? Would people feel interested? Would they think, oh, it's just another rip-off product? So they committed to doing the 7 books, but then said, we're not doing anything else until we see how the 7 do. The New Adventures have been selling very well, so hopefully sooner or later they will come to a decision about whether there will be more adventures. I haven't heard anything.
There are new adventures. They've planned right up to November 1993. And commissioned most of the writers who will be working on them. Some of I think there's a couple that are still floating, but most of the writers have actually been commissioned, and they include quite a few people who worked in the magazine, I'm pleased to say. So, seem to be selecting the right writers.
Yeah. So
basically what's happening with Virgin New Adventures is that after Cat's Cradle, there will start to be, for various reasons, there will start to be altercations between the Doctor and Ace more than you've ever seen on screen, which the Doctor is deliberately engineering so he can get Ace out of the TARDIS, because there's something in the TARDIS that only she can deal with, and if she's outside the TARDIS, she's able to defeat this creature. It will be easily explained in the books rather than the way I'm perhaps explaining it. Ace will leave the Doctor and will be joined by a completely new creative companion called Bernie Summerfield, who will follow the Doctor and then 8 will rejoin in late '93. That's the game plan. So, and they're still going to continue with one book every 2 months. They did consider doing a schedule which involved doing 1 book a month, but realised that what would happen was that the book stockists, rather than restocking the books like John's Time of Genesis, would simply order the new book. So to maintain the good sales and go to reprinting on the original books, which was cheaper to do, they have decided to stick to the bi-monthly
on the shelf life.
It's on the shelf life, just like making a magazine monthly means it's on the shelf and the use age is longer, hopefully.
Actually, hopefully it'll be shorter because it'll sell out faster.
Well, I hope so. Well, they might be able to find it. In terms of the factual books, they're going to be producing a series of books by the people who produce a very good fanzine called Freeman. One on the 60s, one on the 70s, one on the 80s. I don't think they'll be doing one on the 90s just yet somehow.
Be very thin.
Very thin.
Yes.
And also some pocket books on each individual doctor, starting with one on Tom Baker.
What a surprise.
Funny enough, this is the best selling, most popular.
Yes, isn't it amazing?
As far as the strings to my bow go, obviously the court case is something that will at least take us up until March next year, because that's when we're actually going to announce the prizes for the competition. It's going to be quite a showy affair. I think what the ambition is to hold the prize draw at the Museum of the Moving Image, at which marionettes and Terence Dix, the two, between them encompass acting, directing, script writing, script editing, and producing between them. So literally there's nothing they don't know about the series. It's a Department of Postage stamp with this face and signing name underneath. That will be happening around Easter next year, which is why we said to Mark Gaspars that we're looking at a big final push at your convention, because that's happening at the end of March, I believe. And so, in a way, try and tie that in with the announcement of the competition results, by which time, hopefully, we'll have got something moving with the BBC. John says if they're bringing repeats into the equation, it means you've at least got them rattled by the prospect that finally, after so long, you're hitting them where it hurts, i.e. at the top, rather than just upsetting awful lots of secretaries, postman people, and really the people who don't really want to be bothered with having hundreds of Doctor Who fans ringing them up and writing to them, just saying, where's the programme? Because they can't answer it. All they can do is just log in, pass it up through infinite lines of managers, probably never even touching the guys who can actually make the decision, have the decision. That said, there are things going on with Doctor Who that we don't know about. I mean, obviously, the BBC is like any company. It doesn't give out its plans in advance, and there are very good procedural reasons for doing this. Everything has to be tied down. I don't think Doctor Who's as dead as perhaps we've all made it sound like in the last hour. There are things going behind the scenes. We don't know what it is. The reason for keeping on the pressure, for applying the pressure, is twofold. Firstly, to show that there is still a lot of people out there who are very concerned about the series and don't like the fact that it is appearing to be treated in such a cavalier fashion. And secondly as well, because we would like it to come back as a quality product. I know it's quality is one of those great abstracted tangibles, what is quality, what isn't quality. Just as a lot of people felt slightly jilted after that cancellation business in 1986, when it came back and the first thing they threw at us was Bonnie Langford, which really in England did not go down with quite the success factor that you perhaps think of with Doctor Who. We would like to see Doctor Who at least being considered seriously as the programme that should be made for an audience which is probably now generally in its 30s and 40s, treated adult drama in the same, according to the same status as you would do some of these dramas. Don't think that you're just doing it for underage mentally retarded kids or
the BBC aren't averse to producing fantasy programmes. They are producing some very good fantasy programmes for children's TV. There's a particularly good programme called The Dark Season, which is going out on children's TV, which is all set around a school and some bizarre computer technology being used, which is excellent. But they haven't really hit on an alternative to Doctor Who itself, and they're more likely to go with Doctor Who because it's a name that everybody knows. At a recent meeting of independent producers, they would describe Doctor Who as one of their war horses, which would be brought out to challenge the ratings. And I can tell you that I have met some producers, I've met one producer, would-be producer of Doctor who is not a name associated with the programme in the past, who does seem to be approaching a deal, and I will know very soon whether or not they have done. If they don't, then we'll publish the things that we're going to produce, because I can tell you the things that I've seen, some of the visual effects and some of the storylines were incredible. I personally have in mind as the Doctor, who, because I signed a confidentiality act, I can't name. It's absolutely stunning. I think it would be pretty good. But I can tell you very clearly. I won't be beating on the bush here, but I can tell you that if it does come back, it will come back as a 50-minute program, which will be ideal for sale in this country.
But having said that, because of the fact you've virtually got to start doing Doctor Who from scratch, because as you know, the BBC are clearing their vaults out of costumes and props and things, which is why you're getting all these auctions and things being announced in Britain. My personal belief is that if you're going to bring Doctor Who back, and with that close, I think seriously you would be looking at 1993 as a platform for relaunching the series. Tied in with its 30th anniversary, tied in with the fact that by that time you will have that groundswell that brought Star Trek back in America with such a perfect audience, almost pre-prepared for it. And it gives you a year's worth of pre-publicity that the producers of Batman have found out as there's absolutely nothing like a year's worth of pre-publicity to give you that energy and that hype and that ready-made audience for when it does come back. So I don't think even if they signed a deal tomorrow, you'd see much before the end of 1992, in which case you might as well go to 1993.
You can still see a pilot for Christmas 1992, but beyond that, we'll see if it any comment.
If it does come back, what do you think the chances are that it will be Sylvester McCoy or the older again?
I don't think. Basically, Sylvester's agreed that if he comes back, he would be willing to do a regeneration sequence, but I think he wants out of it. It's been going on for quite some time. Still the Doctor as far as Marvel are concerned, because nobody said that he isn't, and as such he appears in the comics, the main comic strip running most months, as does Sophie Aldred, but I don't think they're too worried about being typecast as comic strip editors.
You can't make you fair for being able to use other Doctors in the live comic strip, should we say? My policy now is to use, in the unit special we've done a John Pertwee story, we negotiated the right to use John Pertwee, and I have a William Hartnell story lined up for the next special that we do. Which will be drawn by somebody like John Burns. Well, just want to put you in on a couple of other things, talking about strings of the bow. One of the other problems we had in Britain is that the BBC are very good, as I was saying earlier, closing down their facility. One of the big problems we have now is that they've closed their script unit, which was a wonderful little, tiny wing of the BBC run by these Margaret Rutherford type ladies. Their basic job was to see the scripts for all the drama programs were made and basically file them, stamp file in next week, give a number, and put them on the shelves. And this facility was always made available to the public. You could actually go on there, pay a modest fee, and read any script going right back to the first BBC science fiction Time Machine production in 1949. The trouble is the BBC is greatly fond of its cost-cutting reviews. And recently they had a topic of where can we save money. Now in television production it's the easiest thing in the world to hide spending. My God, you can hide it under a bracket of so many different headings, subheadings and paragraphs. It's easy to say, well you can't possibly have that money because look, you counted for every penny. The script unit, it was such a nice little modular thing. They knew how much the premises cost, they knew how much the staff costs were. And they said, oh, I think we can do without that. Hey, with the BBC, our charter doesn't say we've got to run an archive. That's going. But it wasn't for the British Film Institute. All the drama scripts, these wonderful old documents that really are the backbone of so much of the research that people like myself, Andrew Dixley, David Howard, people like that are doing, to be able to bring the publication and, in a way, the research of the programs that we're just going on to exist. The BFI has taken these things on. Is now currently moving them to their premises in London. The main problem is with them, it's going to be a much more involved process to go and read these things. So one of the things we're trying to do at the moment is to come to an agreement with the British Film Institute on how future researchers and archivists are going to have access to these. It's going quite well, but at the moment, we're still not at a stage where you can publish something in the monthly, or let's say people, if you are a serious researcher, this is the office you'll need to contact if you're doing any serious program work on BBC drama of any sort. So that's what to be sort of like something on the lines.
So do you want to know about any new merchandise? Okay, new merchandise from Doctor Who, including the book and Doctor Who magazine. The people who've been producing t-shirts, some of which you'll have seen in the dealer's room this week, there's a new company called LPI, which are producing 10 new Doctor Who t-shirts. There's a company called Amaran, who produce model kits, and they're producing some mass-manufactured Doctor Who kits. I don't know what they are, I haven't talked to the company yet. Silver Screen International are continuing to produce CDs of Doctor Who music, and they're hoping to expand that to include music from other shows, such as probably Blake's Second, which may be to people who just come in to see Stephen Tracy. And
Mentioning
your names. And also some of the Jerry Anderson stuff. And they're definitely a label to watch for. They're distributing the Brent Spiner record and the Michelle Nichols record into Britain, so they're really on the ball when it comes to the science fiction music.
They've just done the second one with Prisoner too.
Yeah. T-shirts. BBC Audio. Now this is something to watch, but I don't know who will be distributing in this country. But they're planning to do missing stories that have been damaged visually, like the Tomb of the Cybermen, the Macro Terror, and Evil of the Daleks, the first three. What they're going to do is they're going to do audio tapes of these three productions, of which don't exist in full visual format, because the audio tapes were kept separately and was supplied by Richard Lambert to the BBC to be used to produce these new audio tapes. They'll probably be available to his friends who got to do at some point. I imagine they're probably the best people to contact. The parts where there's a fight sequence or where a Dalek rides into the room on the TV screen will be narrated by different doctors. Tom Baker has done 2. Am I correct?
Colin Baker, Tom Baker, and John Pertwee.
Now, John Pertwee did Evil of the Daleks. Tom Baker has done the Macro Terror.
Yes.
That's Colin Baker. I get confused between the Bakers. But they've all done these new tapes. In America, Day of the Daleks comes out on Laserdisc very soon. We knew that already. Bruce Campbell, again, I keep mentioning he's one dealer, but he's the one who's producing it. So that's something to watch for. And there are some other things that are coming out.
There are also further, for any of you that are considering trips to the United Kingdom, perhaps next year. John says the Moni exhibition has been extended now until Easter, which is basically mid-April next year. And again, don't even think it may close then, because as I said, we were firmly convinced it was shutting down in January, and there were plans to follow that immediately by an exhibition of Hammer Films, all these British films.
Which in Scoots,
which, yes, one of the technicians who worked on Doctor Who, in Scoots, and Day 7, put together. But we're definitely not quite sure yet at this moment in time whether that's actually going to happen now, which would be a great shame if it doesn't. But then again, such as the popularity of Doctor Who is continuing there. And there are plans for ancillary events actually at the National Film Theatre itself. They've already had 2 weekends, both of which are superbly structured, because unlike conventions, what they're asking each of the guests there to do is to prepare a 40-minute discussion on talk on the subject of his or her background. Nicholas Courtney, for instance, basically covered his years as an actor with Doctor Who. The costume designers basically showed you how costumes were put together for the programme. And the visual effects people came in with these huge barrage of slides and models and things to show you how the miniatures for the series were done. There's at least one more of those happening. John Aiken Turner is actually organising and planning these, so both of them have booked out very solidly. So if you know you're going to the UK in February or March next year, keep an eye on the monthly, because it will carry the details of these events when they come up, and they are certainly worth attending.
And that's it. I'm sorry, question.
Drug merchandise, I'm just curious, something like the years kids, a lot of us are in America very interested in, why would we not release something to this?
I don't know. Talk to BBC Limelight and find out. Or talk to who's the company that produces merchandise?
CBS Fox.
CBS Fox, yeah, they don't seem to know what Doctor Who is, do they? When I talked to them, they sent me a list of things they were releasing, and then phoned me up and said, oh, we're not releasing these at all. So we had to put into retraction, and then the very next day, they actually announced that they were releasing them, they said they weren't producing. So they just seem to know even less what they're doing than the BBC do, but...
And we didn't think we could find somebody.
I didn't think we could find somebody, but CBS Fox seems to fit that category. But try CBS Fox and ask them like a bit of time to produce them. Tell them about them, tell them they're really good at whatever. Tell them they sold over, they sold
About 16,000.
they've sold 18,000 units in Britain, which could, you know, percentage terms, they can work out, I'm sure. Extrapolate from those.
So there are people that are so interested in buying and piling these kind of pictures.
No. Okay, any more questions? We're going to have a wrap. Well, all right. Thank you very much for your time.
Steve,